He sat across from me, slid my termination letter like it was nothing, and smiled. He thought cutting my paycheck would cut my spine. What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, was that I already owned the building we were sitting in. If you love a story where the underdog doesn't just survive, she conquers, smash that like button, subscribe, and don't you dare leave before the ending. Trust me, the revenge is worth every second. I was not born into comfort. I want you to understand that before anything else. There was no safety net beneath me, no family name to open doors, no trust fund quietly waiting with my name on it. There was just me, a small apartment that smelled like old carpet and ambition, a scholarship that covered tuition but nothing else, and a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry just so I could eat something warm before my night classes. I watched her hands get rough. I watched her back bend, and I promised myself, I promised her, that one day those sacrifices would mean something, that they would add up to something she could be proud of. So I worked. God, I worked. While other girls my age were figuring out who they were, I was figuring out balance sheets. While people were enjoying their 20s, I was building mine into a career, brick by painful brick. By 29, I had clawed my way to senior financial analyst at one of the most respected investment firms in the city, Caldwell and Brett Capital. I had my own client portfolio. I had a track record that spoke louder than any introduction. I trusted the system because the system had, up until that point, rewarded me for trusting it. I believed, truly, deeply believed, that if you were good enough, if you were sharp enough, the work would protect you. That belief was the most expensive thing I ever owned, and I paid for it with everything. Ronan Breck was the kind of man who made a room feel smaller just by walking into it. Not because he was physically imposing, he wasn't. He was polished, well-dressed, the sort of man who remembered your birthday and forgot your humanity. He had co-founded Caldwell and Breck 20 years ago, and somewhere along the way, success had curdled inside him into something darker. Something that needed to control everything it touched. I noticed things about Ronan that other people were too comfortable to notice, or too afraid to say out loud. I noticed the way numbers moved around in quarterly reports when they shouldn't have. Small shifts, quiet adjustments, the kind of thing that only registers if you have been staring at figures long enough for them to feel like a language. In my third year at the firm, I found it, a $12 million discrepancy that pointed directly toward an offshore account. I documented everything. I flagged it through the proper internal channel with a full written report, the way a good employee was supposed to, the way an honest one would. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought he would thank me. Instead, I had just made myself the most dangerous person in that building, and Ronan Breck did not leave dangerous things unaddressed. He neutralized them, quietly, methodically, with a smile on his face the entire time. I didn't know it yet, but the moment I submitted that report, I had stopped being an employee in his eyes. It was on the 9th day of that silence that I finally looked at the envelope. It had been sitting on my kitchen counter for 3 months, cream-colored, thick, with a law firm's return address printed in small, serious letters, Adair and Associates, my grandmother's attorney. I had never asked what she left behind. It felt intrusive. It felt premature. It felt like something I could handle later. Later had arrived. I opened the envelope with steady hands, expecting something modest. A piece of jewelry, perhaps. A small savings account. Maybe a letter with advice I was not ready to receive. What I found instead was a 40-page legal document, a letter from Felix Adair, requesting my urgent presence at his office, and a single handwritten note in my grandmother's careful, slanted script that read, "Vivian, you were always the one. I simply waited for you to know it too. Everything is yours. Use it like I taught you. Quietly and completely." I read that note 4 times. Then I picked up the phone and called Felix Adair. And sitting in his office 2 days later, listening to him walk me through the full scope of Dorothea Calloway's estate, I understood for the first time in my life what it felt like for the entire ground beneath you to shift. Not crumble, not collapse, but shift. Like the world had simply been rearranged while you were looking the wrong direction. My grandmother had not left me comfort. She had left me power. And for the first time since that glass-walled room, I felt something move inside my chest that was not grief and was not rage. It was something quieter than both, something colder, something that felt, in the most unexpected way, like the very beginning of everything. There is something deeply misunderstood about revenge. People think it is loud, They imagine it as something explosive, something that announces itself with fire and noise and a dramatic confrontation in a crowded room. But real revenge, the kind that lands so precisely it leaves no room for recovery, is almost unbearably quiet. It arrives in the form of a letter, a phone call, a single sentence delivered in a calm, pleasant voice that somehow carries the weight of everything that was ever done to you. Mine arrived on a Wednesday morning, in the form of a formal lease non-renewal notice. I'm sent from Adair and Associates on behalf of the Callaway Commercial Property Trust to the offices of Caldwell and Breck Capital. 90 days to vacate. I was not in the room when Ronan received it. I did not need to be. Felix called me that evening and described it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time for a moment like this. Ronan's assistant had called their building manager first, panicked. The building manager had called his supervisor. The supervisor had traced the trust ownership through 3 layers of legal documentation before the name finally surfaced. Before my name finally surfaced. By the time Ronan himself picked up the phone and called Felix directly, his voice had lost that smooth, controlled quality I remembered so well. There was something frayed in it, something that had not been there before. Felix put the call on speaker. I sat across from him and listened. Ronan offered to renegotiate. Then he offered a premium rate. Then he mentioned carefully that he hoped there were no personal feelings influencing a business decision. Felix responded that all decisions were purely professional. I said nothing. I simply sat there and breathed, slowly and evenly, the way you breathe when something that has been pressing against your chest for months finally lifts. When the call ended, Felix looked at me and asked if I wanted to respond with anything. I thought about it for a moment, truly thought about it, and then I shook my head. There was nothing I needed to say to Ronan Breck that the letter had not already said with far more eloquence than I ever could. The first domino had fallen, but a building was only real estate. What Ronan had stolen from me was not just a lease. It was my name, my record, my identity as someone who worked honestly and deserved to be treated with dignity. That required something different. Something that could not be quietly reassigned or legally dissolved. Something permanent. Graham Osei published the first part of his 4-part investigative series on a Thursday morning. By noon, it had been shared 11,000 times. By evening, it had reached people in boardrooms and courtrooms and living rooms who had never heard of Caldwell and Breck Capital and now would never forget the name. Part 1 detailed the offshore account irregularities, the exact discrepancy I had flagged in my internal report, now documented with supporting financial evidence that Nadia had reconstructed with forensic precision. Part 2 named the 6 other women, besides me, who had been systematically targeted, quietly discredited, and pushed out of the firm over 7 years. 6 women who had each carried their silence alone, believing they were isolated cases, never knowing they were part of a pattern. Reading their accounts, even though I had heard each story privately during our meetings, broke something open in me that I'd been keeping carefully sealed, because their pain was my pain. And seeing it written down, documented, witnessed, and believed for the very first time, that mattered more to me than any building, any commission, any number on any page. Part 3 covered Brett Harlow and the fraudulent contract filing, with documentation so clean and irrefutable that his lawyers did not even attempt to dispute it publicly. Part 4 named Claudette Wren, the HR director, who had sat across from me with her clipboard and her careful neutral expression, and had processed my termination knowing exactly what it was and exactly what it was not. Clients began pulling accounts within 48 hours. Not trickles, withdrawals. The kind of withdrawals that make a firm's internal phones ring constantly and make men who have never once questioned their own judgment suddenly sit very still and stare at their hands. I did not celebrate. I sat with Nadia in her small office surrounded by file boxes and cold takeout containers, and we did not say very much at all. Because we both understood that the women in that article, the ones who had carried this for years longer than I had, deserved more than champagne and congratulations. They deserved to have never needed to be in that article at all. That was the grief underneath the victory. And I held it carefully because it was real, and it was heavy, and it belonged to all of us. The second domino had fallen, and the rest were already leaning. People always want to know about the moment of victory. They want the confetti, the triumphant music, the slow-motion walk away from the explosion. And I understand that. I wanted it too once. In those early days of sitting on my kitchen floor in the silence, I had imagined it so many times. The moment where everything flipped, where justice arrived wearing something dramatic and undeniable. Where I could point to a single second and say there, that is where it all turned around. But when the real moment came, it did not feel like any of those imaginings. It felt quiet. Victory, I learned, does not roar. It simply settles, like dust after a long collapse. I thought about my mother. I always come back to my mother. I thought about her rough hands and her double shifts, and the way she used to hum softly while she ironed her uniform at 5 in the morning, not because she was happy, but because she was determined. She had poured every drop of that determination into me. And sitting in that chair, in an office that I had built from the wreckage of everything Ronan Breck tried to reduce me to, I finally felt worthy of what she had given. I did not spend the first weeks celebrating. I spent them building. The Callaway Fund came first, a financial scholarship and mentorship program for first-generation women entering corporate finance. Named not after my victory, but after my grandmother, because Dorothea Callaway had understood something that took me years and one brutal termination to learn. That real power is not what you accumulate. It is what you activate in others. The building that Caldwell and Breck vacated, the one that had housed their glass-walled conference rooms and their marble lobbies and their carefully curated sense of superiority, I converted it into a co-working hub for women-led startups. Nadia became my CFO. Felix became my general counsel. 2 of the 6 women from Graham's article joined as senior partners in the boutique advisory firm I quietly launched. Quietly, always quietly. Because I had learned from the best that the loudest thing a powerful woman can do is simply continue. We did not hold a press conference. We did not issue a statement. We opened our doors, and we did exceptional work, and we let that be the announcement. It was Graham who told me, casually, over coffee, the way you mention something you are not sure deserves more weight than it carries. He had spotted Ronan at a mid-level real estate investment seminar on the other side of the city, not presenting, but sitting in the 3rd row with a yellow legal pad and a look that Graham described, carefully, as reduced. I listened. I nodded slowly, and then I said, with complete and total sincerity, I hope he finds what he's looking for. Graham looked at me for a moment, trying to read whether there was edge beneath the words. There wasn't. Or perhaps there was, but it was so old and so healed over by that point that even I could no longer find it. Ronan Breck was not worth my fury anymore. He was not worth my energy, my attention, or a single additional second of the mental space he had occupied for far too long. The most complete revenge I had come to understand was not his destruction. It was my indifference, the fact that his name could come up over a cup of coffee and leave no wound whatsoever. That was the moment I knew it was truly over. My grandmother used to say that a woman's greatest weapon is never what the world expects it to be. Weapon is her patience, the willingness to wait until the moment is right, to hold yourself together when every instinct is screaming to fall apart. To walk out of a glass-walled room without a single word because you already know something the people in that room do not. I think about that day often, the termination letter sliding across the table, Ronan's satisfied smile, the faces of colleagues watching through the glass like it was entertainment. I think about the woman who stood up, picked up her bag, and walked out without giving any of them the satisfaction of her reaction. I used to think that woman was holding herself together out of pride. Out of stubbornness, out of sheer refusal to break in front of people who would have enjoyed it. But now I understand something different. That woman was not holding herself together. She was holding herself ready. She was 3 moves ahead in a game nobody else even knew had started. She had her grandmother's blood in her veins and her mother's spine in her bones. And something quietly ferocious living in the space between her ribs that no termination letter, no frozen commission, no glass-walled audience could ever reach or touch or take. He wanted to destroy my livelihood. Instead, he handed me my destiny. And if you have ever been underestimated, if someone has ever looked at you and seen a problem instead of a person, a liability instead of a legacy, then I want you to hear this, clearly and completely. Your silence is not surrender. Your patience is not weakness. And the fact that you are still standing, still breathing, still here, that is not a small thing. That is everything. That is where it all begins, and that, every single piece of it, is the story of how I went from sitting on a cold kitchen floor in silence to standing in a building that used to belong to the man who tried to erase me, watching 12 young women walk through doors I had built specifically so they would never have to claw through walls the way I did. It is the story of a grandmother who never once told me she was wealthy because she wanted me to first discover that I was. It is the story of a mother whose rough hands and early mornings became the most expensive education I ever received. The one that no firm could terminate and no Ronan Breck could ever reassign. It is the story of 6 women who carried their silence alone for years until one article, one truth, one moment of collective courage made the whole architecture of a predator's power simply collapse. But more than anything, it is a story about what happens when someone mistakes your stillness for defeat, when they look at your patience and call it passivity, when they slide a letter across a table with a satisfied smile, genuinely believing that a paycheck was the only thing standing between you and nothing. They never check what else you are carrying. They never ask what is waiting quietly in a cream-colored envelope on a kitchen counter. They never stop to consider that the woman they just walked out of their glass room might already own the ground beneath their feet. That is their mistake. And in my experience, it is always, always their most expensive one. So, if this story moved you, if it sat somewhere in your chest and pressed on something real, I am asking you to do something right now before this video ends and the moment passes. Hit that like button. Not for me, but as a small act of agreement that stories like this one deserve to be heard. That women who rebuilt themselves from the ruins of someone else's cruelty deserve to have their stories witnessed and shared and carried further than one screen. Subscribe if you have not already, because I promise you, we are just getting started. Every story we tell on this channel is one that was never supposed to be told. One that someone, somewhere, tried to keep quiet. And we are going to keep telling them, one by one, for every person who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or handed a termination letter by someone who smiled while doing it. Share this video with someone who needs it today. You know exactly who that person is. The one who is sitting in their own silence right now. The one who is carrying something heavy and has not yet opened their own envelope. The one who is 3 moves ahead but has not quite found the courage to make the first one yet. Send it to them. Sometimes the most powerful thing one person can do for another is simply say, "Here, someone told this story for you." And before you go, drop a comment below and tell me, what was the moment in this story that hit you the hardest? Was it the kitchen floor, the envelope, the lease non-renewal, the article, or that final line that Vivian never said out loud but carried in her eyes every single day after? Tell me. I genuinely want to know. Because every comment, every share, every person who finds this story, that is another door opening. And if Dorothea Calloway taught us anything, it is that doors, once opened by the right hands, have a way of staying open for everyone who comes after. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I told you the revenge was worth it. It always is.